Seth, good afternoon, buddy.
How we doing, Scott? Are you feeling fully recovered from the weekend?
I gotta say, and to you, Seth, and to our audience, if you hear a little bit of scratchiness in my voice, is because I don't scream that often. But being at 4 days of a festival in the blazing sun with everything, like it took a little bit's toll. I think you may be able to see a gray hair coming in there, Seth.
I was going to say, good thing you don't have HD. It may be more than that on both of our ends, to be honest with you.
Snap!
So, yeah.
But well worth it. As you guys know, last weekend was Lollapalooza, and Seth and I had a very unique chance to go, essentially, I won't say backstage, but to the media lounge, and through a good friend of ours, we were able to interact with even some artists and just other people in the media, and so it was a really unique perspective on this, essentially a global event. And Seth, in one word, man, if you had to describe your experience, what would it be?
I would just probably say overwhelming in a good way. It was just, I had been to Lollapalooza, I believe 3 times previously as a fan. So to kind of see how the nuts and bolts work behind the scenes, both like from a PR and artist management standpoint, and even from like seeing the amount of trucks that are happening, seeing the artists being brought to and from stages, like just the logistics of a festival that big are really overwhelming. And the fact that they've kind of found that perfect plot of land in Grant Park with which to do it, kind of having the stages separated beautifully, having the plenty of area behind the scenes to kind of make the logistics happen, and it being fairly seamless was really just an overwhelming experience for me and made me appreciate even more the production that goes into something this large. So what were your reactions?
Almost the same, but I got to say it was well run, almost to a fault, almost to the point where I felt like there wasn't any rock and roll in it. That may sound like a little bit of an older interpretation of it, but it was so well oiled. I mean, Seth, you said it right. The trucks, the PR, the moment you and I got our passes, right? It was like the machine was on. Our emails were our inbox was being flooded by the marketing machines of each band. And that's what I was amazed about. The moment it hit, it was like, it's on. This is a business. And I don't think it's a surprise. It's just like, wow, you're always questioning, like, well, what's the spirit of the festival? And how does that relate to the actual festival?
Totally. And I think this made me realize, particularly this year, when I think, talking about lineup choices, there was obviously a lot of weight at the top of the lineup with Metallica, with Green Day, with a bunch of different artists, J. Cole, J-Hope, got a little K-pop in there. But there was a lot of that. And then there was a lot, you can tell in particular this year, they were using Lollapalooza as an opportunity to break artists, to kind of use this as give artists that you may not have heard of or are really just getting momentum, a little bit of traction and a little bit of credibility. I felt like there was maybe a gap in the in-between, sort of in the, have made it, are credible, maybe aren't headliners, but everybody kind of knows who they are. And I look back at lineups in years past, and that seemed to be relatively, my gut seemed to be correct on that. But just this idea of being a well-oiled machine with PR people, I mean, I probably got, 100 plus emails in the 2 weeks leading up to, and then continuing during the fest to go see artists, go to after shows, try to connect, to chat. And I'm sure some of them were sort of like mass mailings, but it's incredible how much it's meant to build the credibility of the artists that are there to be able to say, like, hey, fresh off of Lollapalooza, now they're coming on tour to your city. Make sure you go see them.
That's exactly right. It was immediate. Let me ask you a question about the lineup, which is obviously a huge portion of the show. Do you think they should have, for example, a stage where it says like up and coming, or a way to kind of instead of kind of sprinkle it around each stage? How did you feel about that? How they kind of would put them in the kind of the earlier parts of the show.
Yeah, I think I don't know that I would change much, to be honest with you. I think because there's different versions. There's smaller stages that are tucked away, that are up and coming, and you have to sort of seek it out. But those are almost like the real people who are trying to find something that may be a little bit out of the mainstream.
Yeah.
And then on the big stages, it's artists that like musically are mainstream, but maybe don't have a lot of popularity yet. So you kind of go you gravitate towards the, and there's obviously a stage that's more EDM, a stage that's more hip hop, a stage that's more rock. So it's not explicit, but you kind of get a sense after going for a few days that there is some method to the madness. My thought is there's usually just a mix of like, because again, it's a huge opportunity. Bands that would normally play to rooms of 100 people are now in front of, even if it's 1,500, that's a huge opportunity to have a kind of a ripple effect. And I wonder how much the management companies and agencies that partner with Lollapalooza maybe use that too much to break new artists and not enough to provide sort of like tried and true festival bands. And I was even looking at other festivals happening this summer, Outside Lands Festival, things like that are sort of newer, but just seem to have a lot of more of that, like that middle section of artists. And I wonder how much of it was intentional and how much of it was just sort of like the quirks of booking. But
well, do you think it was economic? Do you think they were just cheaper?
I doubt it. I mean, they probably were, but I also think of all festivals, Lollapalooza can afford to kind of, put on whatever lineup they're able to book. I also know I had heard somewhere that they have a rule, for lack of a better way to say it, that if the artist is played in the market within, I think it's 90 days of the festival, it's within 100 miles within 90 days of the festival, they're off. They want it to be exclusive. They want to get exclusive artists, which is a wonderful idea in theory, but in practice, with how many festivals there are, and with the fact that everybody's on tour right now because they couldn't tour for 2 years, I feel like that may be a bit of a limiting factor in who they're able to book. And like I said, nice idea 10 years ago. I don't know that served them well this time around. And it's not a complaint, but more of an observation. Like I said, we had an incredible experience and did learn about a lot of bands I was not as familiar with, but I was really hoping, let's say from our like 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock hour of the festival, those bands that would be like, okay, we're definitely hitting these guys. There weren't as many of those this year, which is fine, but just an observation.
Well, what was your standout, a band that you were, interested in seeing and one that just kind of blew you away? That was just so impressive.
Yes. So I mentioned this a few times. If anybody followed us on Instagram, on our stories or anything like that,
I know. So
shout out to those who did. But one of the first shows I saw of the week on Friday was a band called Flip Turn. They're out of, I think, Jacksonville, and their album comes out in about 2 or 3 weeks. But I would call it kind of like, it's pop, indie pop, but very melodic. The singer, not quite falsetto, but like just really interesting music with tight, well-written songs that kind of go far above and beyond an artist that is just putting out their first album. So I feel like a few of those songs that are even out there now, you may hear them get some traction on the radio, like in the fall and the winter. I have high hopes for that band. I was also incredibly impressed, weirded out, I don't even quite know what to say, with Royal Blood, who you came to see with me, Scott. It was basically, a very hard rock band with 2 musicians, one of them being a drummer, a good drummer, but a very specific personality of drummer. And then
they would call that some guys would call that like a fraternity douchebag, dude. I'm just saying, like no judgment.
I don't know. That sounded pretty judgy to me, but, but I know.
And where would he live, Seth? You and I were laughing about this. Just to tell everyone,
he's definitely a Vegas or a Phoenix guy, no question about it. Even though I think they might be British, but just the vibe they were throwing out. But then the guitar, quote unquote, is actually he plays the bass, the 4-string bass, and just uses all these crazy pedals. So it sounds like this wall of rock sound. But it's just one guy playing one instrument, and he manipulates it in such a way that sounds like both guitar and bass parts. So mine was kind of blown from that. I wasn't as familiar, and they had a huge audience at the Bud Light stage, which was one of the 2 main headlining stages. So clearly I'm late to the game, but that presentation really blew my mind because it felt unique during the week. How about you?
That was unique to me because it was almost, if I can say it, a 90s rock sound.
Yep.
And the crowd there went, it ran the whole gambit there. I saw kids up to, people in their 50s, but that was my first impression. It's like, wow, this is I don't know if you call it a vintage sound or a retro sound, but heavy guitar, heavy drums, just the whole style reminded me of that, almost Orange County punk in the late 90s.
Yeah. And it seemed to really resonate with the audience that was there, which, like you said, was mixed. Maybe that one skewed a bit older, But those were just kind of two off the top of my head. I missed Sam Fender on Thursday. I heard from other people, and I know from his other performances that he really crushed it there as well. I can't speak firsthand, so I don't want to lie in case someone calls me on it. But that's another kind of up and coming artist that I think really turned some heads this weekend.
Well, let me ask you this, Seth. Let's say you're the organizer for Lollapalooza, right? Your new title. Who would you put in there that you think this would be accretive, right? Incremental, that would have just like topped it off?
I mean, that's such a hard question. I'm trying to think like middle of the bill type artists, but I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to start just doing my own wish list. But if you can pull in bands that maybe would have played like a Bleachers type band, or like
what about like Whitney?
Yeah, that's actually a great example. A band who's about to put out an album, a band who has Chicago ties. And I bet if it was 2 months later and they were kind of in full touring mode, Whitney would be. I'm actually wearing a Whitney t-shirt right now.
Oh, look at that. And we did not plan that, folks.
Product placement. Yes. But that's a perfect example of like maybe not a headliner band, but a band that a lot of music oriented people in Chicago would have heard of and could have played for an hour at like a 6:30 slot and drawn a huge crowd. And I just felt that those, again, like we talked about this idea of tent poles, right? Of like, okay, I may float around, I may take some thoughts from others, but I'm going to see these three bands at these three times on these three stages that kind of shape my day. And there was a bit less of that. I don't want to just keep harping on it, but it was an interesting observation in the first year that I've really seen it be that way. So
now, one of the things you had mentioned in one of our Instagram stories, it was the year of women.
Yeah. In particular,
and it was immediately noticeable, like in the interview, just to tell everyone in the media section, it was like just really cool rocker women.
Yes, I was women in general, but definitely rock and roll in particular, like guitar bands, you know, kind of traditional, what you think of as a rock band. They were actually there. I mean, again, we didn't cover every stage on every day, but there was a surprisingly few number of like male rock bands. There were some, but there was a lot of hip hop. There was a lot of, even if it wasn't like truly, you know, like digital EDM, whatever, using kind of like electro, I guess.
Yeah.
It like just, there were just not many bands that were just straight forward, like guitar, bass, drums. But you had bands like Wet Leg, which I know like their after show sold out in about 35 seconds. You had bands like Heinz, Crawlers a little earlier on the bill, Pom Pom Squad, Horse Girl, even Flip Turn, who I mentioned, their bass player is female. Like they just, it wasn't, what I thought was cool was it was the year of the female rocker, but it wasn't framed that way at all. Like it wasn't a story. It was just kind of taken to be like normal. And I thought that was really cool. And a great showcase of, again, a few bands that I was not familiar with. Meet Me at the Altar was another one, which is almost kind of like a vintage pop punky kind of sound. We're drawing huge crowds with either all female or kind of female led bands. So an exciting time and noticeable as you kind of think about the split. I thought that was a really cool choice by them.
And I thought it brought such a cool kind of different energy about it. You know, as we were kind of touring the different stages, I thought it was just fantastic. I was so impressed with the variety of the sounds, but just the energy. People were really digging on it, and
that's what I was going to say. The energy, the openness to it. You know what I mean? I wonder how differently that would have been received 10 years ago. But I just think it's like it was a very cool opportunity to see those kind of bands really thriving.
Yeah, and I love how they didn't make a big deal out of it in terms of trying to categorize it. It wasn't like, you know, women in rock or this, you know, the female stage or whatever. I think they actually did a great job throughout the whole festival, not categorizing, not, you know, going that extra step to try to help you. This is the EDM, you know, stage. This is the stage for rock. I think it was as much as they could be organic. I thought it was.
Agreed. Let's talk a little bit about, like we kind of covered the artists. Tell us, Scott, I'm curious your thoughts, and then I'll share mine about just kind of walking around and mingling with the crowd. What was your vibe of who was there? What were they doing? How are they dressed? Like give me your speed round of your observation as a someone who's not been to Lollapalooza ever, maybe. I don't think, right? Yeah.
My immediate impression was people were very well behaved. And I was just so impressed how polite people were. And it was, I mean, you're thinking about organizing all these people, and I didn't see any visible drunkenness. I didn't see anyone like puking or just falling just on the ground, like passing out. I was, I mean, I'm not assuming like people weren't on any other substance or whatnot, but it didn't seem like a shit show. It was very well behaved. I thought the fashion was, how do I say it? It was fun, but I think there could be even more creativity. I thought the guys kind of wearing the basketball jerseys and the bandanas are cool, but I kind of like it where there's no rules. And I think that's the part where I would contrast this with some of the festivals or parties that I went to when I was in my teens or, early 20s, where it felt illegal. It felt like exciting. And I think everyone was having a great time, but I think it's the same way you would say people were having a great time at Disneyland. Like it's there. Yeah. Everyone's structured. Everyone's dancing when they're supposed to dance. Everyone's,
safe. There's no one's on edge about anything. It's just, you're there in an environment you feel, which not to say you should feel threatened or uncomfortable at a show, but I think the way it was structured and like you said, the clientele, the fact that the basketball jerseys thing has been the uniform of Lollapalooza for 15 years. It's literally like, it's become an open joke, yet people still do it. And I found that fascinating, where if you were a guy under the age of 25, probably 40% chance you were wearing a basketball jersey. And that is something I just thought would, like, I thought I was going to be the old man. It's like, remember everybody used to wear basketball jerseys, and that is still very much
the coolest thing is, like,
I have hoopsters.
Seth, I have such old clothing that's older than these people that mine would be vintage, right? Mine would be one of the coolest.
I mean this truly as a compliment, but mostly. But the first day we get there, Scott's wearing like a grubby t-shirt, wind pants, these like these New Balances with Velcro and a tailor-made visor, and I'm like, you're so not cool that you're actually the coolest guy here. Like, it's such a weird outfit. I mean this true. Like, people in the media area, I could tell, were just like, we don't know what this dude is, but he must be like some cool host person or something, because it's such an odd choice that there's no way it wasn't a choice. And little did they know that is Scott in his natural habitat.
Yeah. So I'm telling you, Seth, you're going to get there very soon. Velcro shoes, everyone. You won't go back. I tell you, and get the New Balance. Like, your dad is not wrong. Those shoes are actually comfortable.
10 million dads can't be wrong.
They can't.
But I'm just saying, I think people were impressed. That's
thank you.
You mixed it up.
I appreciate it. No, that was my overall impressions. I think in the media tent, and I alluded to this a little bit on the previous episode, it was, I think I gave the analogy of going into a break room at an Office Depot or a Walmart. People just doing their job. It's the grind. And this is the one thing our good friend Piers had told us, is that these media guys and the bands are going from festival to festival, even within that weekend. So they're flying from Chicago, going to New York or LA. I mean, it's a grind.
Yeah. I know there was a big festival. I think it's I forget if it's Toronto or Montreal. It's called like Osheaga or something. And a lot of bands were playing both. So it's like you play your set and you're on to the next thing where you're playing, you're just crossing a border and playing, the same show. But I mean, the way we kind of talked about it is like, you'd see, especially on-air folks, they, if they're interviewers or whatever, they're really, really on and like hyped up and kind of almost like, performatively excited. And then as soon as their little segment is over, it's like, they shut down. They don't want to talk to you. And they're doing work, right? They're trying to get things reported into whomever they're working for. We met a guy from Spin. We saw people from Rolling Stone, from Twitch, all of these different outlets, much, much bigger than ours. NME, which is huge in Europe.
Yeah.
But it was like people, like you said, like people were there, were all business. It wasn't mingling. The bands, there were no, at least when we saw, there were no belligerent, debaucherous Led Zeppelin bottles of whiskey bands. They were all like very organized, very polite. brought around by PR handlers. Here's your next 10 minutes. Okay, time to wrap up. So to our detriment, I think it was tough to like freestyle it and grab someone and say, hey, can I have 5 minutes? Like it was just, there was so much structure. It was so business-like, which I'm sure the organizers and those who are getting those interviews appreciate. Like you get there, you show up on time, you do what we ask you to do. But I think sometimes we would have benefited from a little bit of controlled chaos. I'm just trying to like hop in, grab artists, ask weird questions. And so I don't know if that was a Lollapalooza thing. If all festivals are like that now, I think our hope is that we have the opportunity to cover other festivals at some point. Yeah. But again, so much learnings about how to sort of like pre-wire to make sure that you're successful at that time in the break room, because everybody's using it very strategically. And we were just trying to kind of like be the new guys in the room learning what's going on. Like, or the new kid in school, which lunch table do we sit at? Who do we talk to? Like, it felt a lot like that, didn't it?
Exactly. We walked in, obviously, I guess I was either the guy they thought was lost or the coolest dude with my New Balance. But the only interaction was I don't know if it was an artist or whatever. He goes, hey man, you in the visor, come play ping pong with me. And that was the first. But I was expecting, when you hear this, Seth, I think you and I being fans of music, all the backstage antics, the crazy ego-fueled fights and whatnot. And these artists were just so polite, so structured. And as you said, and it was literally like a loop. You had the big one, Rolling Stone, then you had Hulu, and then you had the local radio stations. And they just kind of went down the line, almost in terms of priority, right? In terms of viewership and readership. And then they just went back to their tent. And it was like, okay, we had and they would drink liquid death water.
Yes,
that was
of course. The undisputed star of Lollapalooza, liquid death brand water. Murder your thirst or whatever their thing is. But they were everywhere this festival. But
but that's an interesting thing, Seth, if you think about it. That's why I said it was so well behaved. You and I did a little video about the bars. There was no one, and that's a bit of a hyperbole, but let's say this. You never had to wait in line to get a drink.
That's absolutely factual. Yep. And I will say, we talked about even like behavior of fans, and we skewed a little bit earlier in the day. And the audience probably skewed a little bit younger, but I can say from personal experience 7 or 8 years ago, there was a lot more misbehavior when I was there. There were a lot more really drunk people. There were a lot more, not incidents, but just people were like kind of zonked very early in the day. And I didn't get that sense, but it extended to the artists as well. And I'm sure coming through the PR loop, they're on their best behavior. We were not in the artist village. That was a separate thing. They were sort of coming to and from that. So maybe they were having a lot more fun over there. But generally speaking, like very quiet, very cordial. But it was striking. The one that struck me on the Saturday was a band called Wallows played, who was kind of like a indie pop punk band, really very young. I forget what show he's in, but the singer of the band is on some TV show. I'm sure listeners might know it. But these kids looked about 22. They were like hanging out. Like there was like kind of a basketball hoop set up backstage. They were shooting around, just like messing around with each other, but very quiet, kind of waiting for people to come up to them. And then a half hour later, I walked out, and I didn't like put the schedule together. Yeah. I walked out to make a loop, and they're playing on the T-Mobile, the main stage, with I'll bet 30,000 people. There's like drones whipping over the crowd. These are the guys that were just sitting around drinking water like a half hour ago. So it's weird to it had these questions spinning in my head. I would have loved to have talked to them. I'm like, how do you sort of rectify this very, you're not that famous. No one backstage really knows you that well. And you're not like some, you don't have this entourage. It's just you guys kind of hanging out. And then you walk up on stage and you're a rock star. How do you deal with that duality of just coming up? It was fascinating to me. And I think we were able to see kind of both sides of a lot of artists the weekend, seeing them prep either before or after, being something close to themselves, and then getting up on stage and being like a persona. That was fascinating to me.
It was unbelievable, the stark difference, just because we were right, behind that T-Mobile stage, essentially. Yeah. And I loved how all the media, as they would kind of usher the artist to the stage, and say, "Oh, have a good show." That was like their, break a leg, I guess, in Hollywood. oh, good show. Have a good show. And they're like, okay, thanks. And then they get
Yeah.
on stage and then they look like they're going berserk. And then you see them come off the stage and they're drinking liquid death,
Yeah.
asking to play ping pong with me. You know,
And
which
yeah,
I
and I
won.
was gonna say, and maybe they're slightly sweatier, but otherwise they're kind of just back to normal. And
Yeah.
it doesn't feel as unusual if you're at, let's say in Chicago, I might say Empty Bottle. That's
Yeah.
200 people or something. It's like, oh, have a good show, and it feels a little
Yeah.
more like on the same level. But to be hanging out, do that on this massive stage with 100,000 watts behind you, you're playing, across 2 football fields worth of sound, and then you just go back to kind of chilling. But it's so weird, and it's really cool, but it's really weird.
Well,
And
let
I'm
me
glad
ask
we
you
got to see it up
a
there.
question, Seth. Which artists would you have wanted to talk to, and what would you have asked them if you had one question?
Oh, I hate these questions where I got to get put on the spot. I would have, I kind of along those lines. I would have. So the guy that I missed, who I would have loved to have seen, Sam Fender, which I mentioned. He's an artist that is hugely popular in Europe, especially in England, but all across Europe. I mean, opening for bands like The Killers, headlining medium-sized tours. I mean, really kind of like, nominated for, I forget what it's called, but whatever the sort of best best British artist is. He's like one of 4 people doing that. And then he's at Lollapalooza playing at like 1 PM to a relatively small crowd. So I would love to just pick their brain about like, you're at this very specific point in your career, Sam Fender. Like you either may or may not blow up in the US. You're already famous. What does this show mean to you? What does this tour mean to you? I think he's opening for Florence and the Machine in the fall on a tour of the US. But it's like this one for the real new artists, I think they're just overwhelmed and it's like just they're happy to be there. There's really big artists that have headlined before and are used to this fanfare. But then there's that artist right on the precipice where it's like you could either break huge or kind of just fade away. How are you feeling? Are you anxious? Are you excited? Like you're on, we talked about this idea of like being on the launch pad.
Yeah.
And those are the artists I think that in the future, we could do a whole series about that of like this launch pad moment and get a sense of how they're feeling about it. And I bet we could even by their reactions and how they're handling it, predict like, ooh, we should follow up with those guys in a year. They're going to be huge. Or I don't know if they're ready for the big time. Like you get that sense a little bit, right?
Well, I think like in sports, it's a very tangible moment, right? It's a big game. This is the critical moment where you're going to go to the playoffs and the player can shine. Is it similar here, you think, or there's variables that we don't even know about, which has that tipping point, as you said?
A little bit of both. But again, we talked about this idea of an opportunity to play in front of a lot of journalists, a lot of fans, a lot of other PR people, your record label who's like, are we going to bet money on this guy or this band or not? And so I think it's almost like before bands get signed, they'll play these things called showcases, which is, typically they'll rent out the Troubadour in LA or something. And it'll be like noon and there'll be a crowd of executives and nobody's clapping or whatever. They're just observing. And you have to basically play for your life, right? Like if you play a great show, you could get a record deal and your life changes. And if you suck, that could be your only shot. And this almost felt like, all right, you passed the first test.
Yeah.
Now, like, are you ready to really be big time? And this is the kind of opportunity where bands' reputations get made, at least in the industry. And so I think that was on a lot of people's minds of, we got to make this one count because there's a lot of eyeballs that wouldn't otherwise be on us. So let's take advantage of this stage.
Do you think there was a moment at this one that if you could say this was their moment, this was their year, or Lollapalooza belonged to these guys?
Yeah. Again, I'm going by the limited number of bands that I actually saw a decent amount of their set, but Flip Turn really felt like that to me. And I don't mean to keep bringing him up, but I was emphatically like, I was just like, these guys are blowing the roof off of it. It's like people are barely awake yet, haven't even had their coffee, and they have the whole crowd in the palm of their hand. Like that would be a good example of a band that I think took their opportunity in front of a big crowd and just knocked it out of the park. And so I know they'll be back in Chicago in I think October, and I'm fascinated to see how big that show is, and B, how many people there, if we talk to them, discover them at Lollapalooza, because I'm sure that's somewhere where you just like make a mental note. You're like, I need to go learn more about this band. I need to see them again. So
I noticed a lot of journalists were covering them as well. And I know even when they finished their set, and you and I were chilling in the media lounge, and you said hello to them. You said, "Hey man, nice show." And they were so nice. These guys were, they seemed like a band, Seth, where some of the other guys, you had the lead singer and they kind of would, essentially answer all the questions on behalf of the rest of the band. They seemed almost traditional, a group of, in this case, it was just a young group of guys and girl that were just having a good time. They seemed like they were going to party afterwards.
Yeah,
like those
they were
guys
taking
have a beer. Yeah.
And when I said, I think I literally was just like, "Hey, amazing show, guys." They were like taken aback. You know what I mean? It's like they almost like they weren't quite used. And maybe it was the context of like the media area. They thought it was like all business, but they were like, "Hey, oh, thank you, man. Thank you." Like they were really emphatic and still in that stage where like they just appreciate everything. And that was really cool to see. So I'm admittedly a bit of a in the bag for them right now, but both their performance, the way they handle backstage, and kind of in the music they're putting out is really worth noting, I think.
Well, I'd say this one thing I loved when you made that comment is you said it with enthusiasm and passion. And that's something, and I had talked about this a little bit with Piers, our good friend, is that somehow in the industry, you don't want to show any passion in a way. It's like, oh, you've now crossed into a fan. It's like if you're working in Hollywood and you're like, oh my God, it's Robert De Niro, But I think that's a shame, because I know those guys appreciate it. It was immediate. You said, "Hey man, be blue," and they looked at you and they stopped and they really acknowledged you.
Yeah,
and
it's almost like this fan snuck in the media. They were so used to like everybody being so passé that by just being like, "Hey, I'm excited about the music you guys are playing," I was like, and I think we both, the first, would you say this, Scott, just to go back to, because I think our experience backstage is really interesting. That first day, we were both just like flies on the wall. We were like, what's again, I keep coming first day in the new school of like, what's the behavior? Can we talk? Should we take pictures? Respectfully, like we knew we couldn't be straight fans, but exactly what the procedure was something we were trying to like pick up on the fly.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of the behavior of journalists covering is just driven by the fact that they saw other people like not do anything and be very like stoic. And so I think having a little enthusiasm is not the worst thing in an industry that, well, obviously still about money, is supposed to be a little more fun than, selling printers or something. I don't know.
Selling pens, right?
Selling pens.
Well, I think that's, Seth, you and I had been talking about what's our angle with D-Side Stories as we go to Lollapalooza. And you and I have been kind of almost trying to think of a strategy, but really just like, where do we fit in? Very simple question. And, some fans of ours, if we can say we have fans and listeners, said, "Hey, you guys are kind of outsiders, coming in." And I think I like that, because I thought we brought a different energy. Maybe it was my horrible outfit or just our vibe of just a positive energy. And I'm not saying there was a lot of negative energy, but just I'd say an enthusiasm. And I told a couple friends, and they, when I asked them, when they asked me, "Oh, what was it like?" And I told them, they're like, "Oh, it shouldn't be that way. It should be this like really fun. It's a fun industry. You're dealing with creative energy. It should be creative on all levels."
Yeah.
And, part of me wants to agree with that.
I think it's, I don't have any judgment on it, because again, we're new to the industry. So who are we to say how to do things? But I felt the same way, and I was a little taken aback. It makes sense now that I've seen it, and now that I know how structured things are. And it's not 1974, and you're not just like sneaking backstage. It's very structured. But to see it firsthand and be like, "Guys, this is a really cool thing you're able to do." Mm-hmm. Act like it, but it's like, it's amazing how quickly even the coolest things people get jaded to. I mean, it's the same thing with like touring bands where they're like, "We know it sounds cool. It's really not glamorous, and we just want to be home." Yeah. And so I can see both sides of it.
We're like, "Hey guys, come sell Sharpies over here, man. We'll bring you in."
Come get a real job for a year, and then you guys, you'll be touring nonstop.
I'm the rock star of this cubicle life that I call my profit center. Well, in any case, everyone listen. Hey, thanks so much for joining us on this Lollapalooza journey. Seth and I just are so grateful. And we had a blast. The whole thing was a positive event. And Seth, I got to say thanks, man. You were a trooper. I know most nights when I was home in bed, after a long day, you went out to parties and really living it up, man. So thanks for taking one for the team.
I had to get just a little dose of that rock star lifestyle, and then bounce back the next day like I'm on tour. So I lived through tell the tale.
And as your gift, I think I'm going to get you a custom made pair of those New Balance white Velcro.
Oh, you're too good to me, my friend. You're too good.
And a visor, buddy. Well, listen, everyone. Hey, thanks so much. And we'll see you next week.
All right. Strap up those shoes, everybody.
Get the Velcro on. See you guys.
All right. See you, man.